Hello friends, my name's Emile, welcome back to some more Forza Top Gear laps. Today we're taking a look at some retro hot hatches. Let's jump into it first with the first car of the day, which is the Volkswagen Golf GTI 16 valve Mark II, 159 horsepower, 2,425 pounds of weight. This is the least powerful vehicle here today, by a pretty hefty margin as well. The next least powerful vehicle here has about a 30 horsepower advantage. However, the Golf is the second lightest vehicle here today, and it's also worth mentioning that the Golf is actually the oldest vehicle here today. So the VW Golf GTI Mark II then, how does it drive? It's pretty decent to drive actually. I will say I've driven quite a few modified versions of this car. I haven't driven too much of the Mark II stock. However, I do know, should you upgrade it, the Mark II can be a very quick car indeed around the track. As it stands stock, handling is very good. Actually, it's a good car to drive, this one. It's sort of at that point where it's only got 140 horsepower, so, you know, understeer really shouldn't be a factor with around 140 horsepower. Understeer only really comes into its own when you get about 200 horsepower pushing through the front wheels. It is slow, however, I will say that much. Again, least powerful vehicle here today, so unsurprisingly it is the slowest vehicle in a straight line here today as well. I mean, admittedly, compared to the cars we had last week, the Golf certainly is not a slouch, but it is a little bit on the slower end when you consider the vehicles here today. But I did enjoy driving the Mark II. It's always fun to drive a Golf. This isn't quite as fun as the Mark I is, but it's certainly a good car nonetheless. Next up, we have the Lancia Delta HF Integrale, 210 horsepower, 2,866 pounds of weight. This is a four-wheel drive vehicle, one of two four-wheel drive hot hatches here today. And it's also worth noting that this is the second heaviest vehicle here today, although that is probably due to that four-wheel drive system. So the Delta then. 210 horsepower is a reasonably decent amount for a hot hatch of this age. It's on the higher end of the power scale compared to some of the vehicles here today. However, the weight might offset that. How does it drive, however? Well, the Delta is very good to drive actually. I really enjoyed driving this. It's got very good turn-in grip, it's got very good turn-out grip. There's virtually no understeer in this vehicle. It really surprised me actually. I was expecting a decent amount of understeer from the Delta. I was kind of expecting this to drive similar to maybe a Subaru Impreza. But no, it was really composed actually. The Impreza suffers from a little bit of understeer. The Delta really doesn't. I mean, if it does suffer, it's only really minimal. I didn't really notice it when I was driving the car. Really good vehicle to drive. Really enjoyed driving this one actually. One of the biggest surprises here today, maybe not the biggest surprise, certainly, but this was definitely a surprisingly good vehicle to drive, and I do actually recommend you go out and try the Delta. I haven't really tried this car much stock, but you will be pleasantly surprised. Next up, we have the other four-wheel drive hot hatch here today. We have the Ford Escort RS Cosworth, or the Cosworth. 224 horsepower, 2,811 pounds of weight. This is the second most powerful vehicle here today. And while it is on the heavier side, it is lighter than the Delta. So, with more power and less weight than the Delta, you'd expect the Escort to drive basically the same as the Delta, just a little bit better. Honestly, between these two cars, I couldn't really tell the difference. The Escort is fantastic to drive as well as the Delta. Really good car to drive. Again, good turning grip, no real issues on the way out of corners. You can just floor it and it'll be fine. Choosing between the Delta and the Escort, you know, the differences aren't particularly noticeable. I would say the Escort is probably a little bit quicker in a straight line, and the Delta might have slightly better handling. But even then, you know, they're really minimal differences. The Escort's fantastic, the Delta's fantastic. You need to drive both of these cars. Admittedly, I'm sure people have probably driven the Escort a bit more than the Delta. Escort Cosworth is, of course, a pretty popular vehicle. Yeah, really good car, actually. Both of these could make very good race cars, you know, C-Class, B-Class, even A-Class, maybe. You know, both of these vehicles could do very well within those classes. And again, I definitely recommend you take a look at the Escort if you haven't already, because it is a great car to drive. Speaking of great cars to drive, we have the Honda Civic Type R EK9 next, 182 horsepower, 2,403 pounds of weight. This is the lightest vehicle here today. However, it is one of the lesser powered vehicles here today. Compared to most of the cars, you know, it's around middle scale, but it still hasn't got a particular large amount of power with only 182. Anyways, the Type R EK9 then. The EK9 is very well known for being a very good handling front wheel drive car. You know, in Forza 4 it was one of the best, in Forza 5 it probably was the best handling front wheel drive car. In Forza Motorsport 6 I think it has been surpassed by a few vehicles. The Abarth 695 by Posto, for example, might be the best handling front wheel drive car in the game. But the Civic is still very much a very good car to drive actually. This thing is great handling. You know, you can just stick it into a corner, it'll go around. It really kind of rivaled the Delta in the Escort, and you wouldn't expect that considering, you know, front wheel drive in the wet. You'd expect this car to have understeer issues, but it really doesn't. The only real issue when it comes to handling with the Civic is it does have a bit of an open differential. It isn't quite as locked as I'd like it to be, but it still isn't too bad. And also, it's worth mentioning with the Civic that straight line speed isn't the best in this car. Again, it's one of the lesser powered vehicles here today, so you would kind of expect that. But all in all, I really enjoy driving the Civic. I always enjoy the EK9, it's one of my favourite hot hatches. Next up, speaking of favourite hot hatches, we have the Volkswagen Golf GTI VR6 Mark III, 172 horsepower, 2,800 pounds of weight. On paper, this is probably one of the worst vehicles here today. 172 horsepower actually means it is the second least powerful, and weighing 2,800 pounds, it's one of the heavier by far. Anyways, the Mark III Golf. I really like the Mark III Golf. It's probably my favourite generation of Golf, which is kind of controversial in most people's books. But I just like the way it looks. I like the VR6 engine. It makes an absolutely godly throaty noise, this engine. Probably the best sounding car here today was the Golf. However, sound aside, how did the Mark III actually drive? It was a heavy car. You can definitely feel that weight. The VR6 engine is known for being a relatively heavy engine, and here in this Golf you can kind of feel that. There's a lot of weight over the front wheels, but it's still pretty decent to drive. Not quite as nice to drive as the Mark II Golf, but it does have the advantage in straight line speed. You know, between this and the EK9, you're definitely better off going for the EK9. As it's just the better handling vehicle, and it's also just as quick in a straight line as the Mark III Golf. However, it still isn't a terrible car to drive. Out of all the hot hatches here today, it's probably one of the ones I'd recommend the least, but I do really like the Mark III Golf, and that engine, no, you can't get over it. Next up, Ford Focus RS from 2003, actually this is the first generation if you will. 212 horsepower, 2,822 pounds of weight. This is a front wheel drive car, unlike the RS Cosworth we had around earlier. So, when I drove this vehicle in Season 3, I was pleasantly surprised. Around the dry track, this car is very good to drive actually. Probably one of the better handling front wheel drive cars in the game. In the wet, however, this car wasn't quite as good. I mean, it was decent. Alright, this is still a pretty darn decent car to drive. But you can feel that bit of understeer in this vehicle. It is quite noticeable. If you're going to tackle a wet track, you do want to probably look more towards the RS Cosworth. However, the Focus still certainly is not terrible. Round a dry track, interestingly enough, the Focus was actually quicker than the Escort. So we're actually going to have to wait and see sort of if those dynamics change in the wet. Straight line speed wise, this car is very good. It's probably quicker than the Escort, to be honest with you, because it has a bit less downforce and so on. Definitely one of the quicker vehicles here today in a straight line. Handling does let it down slightly, but I would still recommend giving the Focus a go because it's still a pretty darn good car to drive. All in all, again, just maybe save it for the dry tracks. I'd probably skip out on using it around the wet tracks. Next up, Honda Civic Type R EP3 edition now. 212 horsepower, 2,624 pounds of weight. Exactly the same horsepower as the Focus, but it weighs 200 pounds less, so you'd obviously expect it to do a bit better. Honestly though, the handling of this car is nowhere near as sharp as the EK9's. It's an alright car to drive. Also, that cone just did a weird dance in the background there. Anyways, it is an alright car to drive. Certainly, as far as hot hatches, you can do a lot worse. Renault Clio S, of course, that's not a good car to drive, but yeah. Anyways, I don't know what that's like in the wet, actually. Maybe I should try that at some point. But yeah, the Civic, going back to the Civic. We're talking about Civics, not Renaults. The Civic's alright to drive. As you can see through there is some understeer issues in this vehicle. Between this and the Focus RS, I would favour the Focus. The Focus is a little bit better through the corners. I would imagine the Civic might be a little bit quicker though. I mean, it does weigh 200 pounds less, so that is definitely a possibility. And it did feel a bit quicker. But you just can't quite take as much corner speed as you can in the Focus RS in the Civic. Yeah, if you're going to choose the Civic for racing, you do want to go for the EK9 over the EP3. It just isn't a particularly amazing car to drive, which is a little bit disappointing. Probably the most disappointing car of the day, to be honest with you. Finally, we have a car which I guess is a hot hatch. We have the Renault Clio V6, 251 horsepower, 3,086 pounds of weight. This is the most powerful vehicle here today. It's also the heaviest. It's also the only car here today that's rear-wheel drive. It's actually mid-engined rear-wheel drive. Now, in the wet, you would assume disaster. However, the Clio is actually pretty decent to drive. I did enjoy driving this one. It's really weird to get back into sort of a rear-wheel drive car after driving all these front-wheel drive cars. One thing that struck me immediately about the Clio compared to every other car here today is how sharp the brakes are. The brakes in this car are just so sharp. They're really, really good. Speaking of good stuff, speed. This car is a lot quicker than most of the things here today. Off the line with the Focus and the Civic, I was sort of looking at the lap timer clock, and it hit about 6 seconds when we hit 60. This would do 0 to 60 in under 5 seconds. It is a very quick car, the Clio V6. The handling isn't amazingly good on this car. You know, I still think the EK9, the Delta, the Escort do handle better than this, but it certainly is not as bad as I would have probably expected. Considering the conditions we are in today. Yeah, the Clio was surprisingly decent. Also, I didn't spin it out like the Stig did in Top Gear. Anyways, on to the times. And the Escort is actually the quickest car of the day, going into 73rd with a 131.627. However, those cars, the Delta and the Escort drove very similar, and while the Delta sets a very similar lap time, going into 74th with a 131.650. There really is not too much between those cars. The Clio V6 actually beats a Lamborghini Miura. It goes into 75th with a 131.729, beats the Miura by a little bit, beats an R32 Golf as well, which is pretty good. Speaking of the R32 Golf, the Ford Focus RS is just under a thousandth of a second in it. The Focus is in 78th with a 132.023. Does beat an E30 M3, which is pretty decent. The Focus just kind of struggled with the wet track. Also, the Escort was quicker in the wet. Moving down the board, the two Civics are right on the toes of each other. In 84th, the EP3 with a 133.764, and in 85th, the EK9 with a 133.833. So, yeah, those two cars were very, very close together. The EK9 would still definitely be my choice. The EP3 just had a decent straight line speed advantage. That's why it's just overtaking the EK9. However, lap time-wise, the EP wasn't that consistent. And down the board, of course, we have the two Golfs of the day. In 94th, the VR6 Mark III with 137.077, which still isn't bad. It beats a Mustang, it beats an old Skyline, beats an MX-5 Miata, which certainly isn't bad. The Mark II Golf is the slowest car of the day, going to 99th with 139.313, but that still isn't anything to be ashamed of. I mean, it beats an Escort, Opel Kadett, Pontiac Firebird, just misses out on a Datsun 240Z as well, so yeah, not a bad time from those vehicles. So there we go, friends, that is some retro hot hatches thrown around. Overall, the front wheel drive cars didn't struggle as much as I was expecting them to, and the Escort and the Delta were king of this track. They were really, really good cars to drive. Next week we're going to be taking a look at some of their modern counterparts, so join me for that. Thank you all very much for watching, friends. My name has been The Real Emile, and until next time, farewell.